Good evening. My name is Bernadette Glover, pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church, Montclair, New Jersey. Thank you for joining us for Reparations and Liberating the Soul of Society, the After Talk. Tonight, we will look at what is the final time, the conclusion, quote unquote, of the matter. But the conclusion is really just a beginning. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus charged his operations team to center themselves, to receive power, in order to see a mission to the end that was going to cost them potentially everything. He charged them with a strategic focus to look at what was local, to look at what was beyond local, to state, you might say, to what applied to the nation, to what applied to the world, to take the whole thing into consideration. Specifically for us, if we were to do a justice assessment of New Jersey, what would the results look like? What weeds have been growing in the Garden State that need to be unearthed? What weeds of injustice have grown tall in the Garden State and need to be eradicated? Yeah. And how do we respond to those who have been overexposed, to those who have been overexposed by spoiled goods that came from a garden that perhaps was sown with not the best of intentions? Tonight, Dr. Nicole Drakeford, Dr. Randall Lassiter, Andrea McChristian, and Dr. Evans Spagner, they will lead us further in this conversation. In the words of a great poet, Margaret Walker, the daughter of an AME minister, let a new earth arise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final cleansing be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Why not? Isn't it time? Aren't we overdue? Thank you again for listening.
Good afternoon. My name is Bernadette Glover, and I'm the pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church in Montclair. Thank you so much for being with us today. You have joined an after talk process session around the topic of reparations and liberating the soul of society. There were a number of other panels that preceded this one, and if you haven't seen those, I invite you to go to our YouTube channel and check them out. But today, you're still in the right place for this after talk conversation. We've got a distinguished group. We've got a distinguished group of men and women of influence who have something to say. We welcome you and we welcome them. I'm going to ask now if they would introduce themselves. And when you introduce yourself, I'm going to ask if you would share with us, when you hear the word reparations, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Good afternoon, and thanks so much, Dr. Glover, and to the St. Paul family for having me. I'm Reverend Dr. Nicole Drakeford. I am the assistant to the pastor at the First Baptist Church of Vauxhall, New Jersey. Additionally, I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, serving now with 21 years of service, presently stationed at Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I'm the Deputy G1 in Personnel and Human Resources, Strategic Operations, under a 2-star general command. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Oh, and reparations, I'm sorry. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I hear the word reparations is acknowledgement. Acknowledging a history of tragedy, but a history of triumph. And finally, acknowledgement that it exists, that it is still a sensitive subject, and it can also be a controversial subject, but at least acknowledgement of it.
Good afternoon. I'm Evan Spagner, and I currently serve as the Minister of Christian Education at the Fountain Baptist Church in Summit, New Jersey, where Reverend J. Michael Sanders is our senior pastor. In that position, I have been afforded several opportunities to serve in organizations, either as the Dean of Christian Education or in a particular leadership role, be it at the district level, at the regional level, state level, as well as the national level with the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, with the New England Missionary Baptist Convention, with the Loch Carey Baptist Foreign Commission Convention. And I mention those because they each provide me with a perspective in terms of my responsibility to that particular segment of the population and how that might relate to what is going on in the larger society. I also bring to the table over 50 years of experience in corporate America, retired from the Bell system after spending about 5 or 6 years with the Anheuser-Busch companies, and then the balance of that period with various aspects of the Bell system. When I think and when I hear the word reparations, I look at it from a business stewardship perspective, and what comes to mind that is low-hanging fruit is I owe you. There is something that has been provided, and there's an obligation to compensate for services rendered. And so I am interested in having the perspective of others and coming to an agreement as to how we can quantify and come up with a commoditization of that notion. If there is something of value that has been given, how do you justify and how do you quantify compensation for services rendered? That's what comes to mind.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Reverend Dr. Randall Lassiter, the pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in the city of Patterson. We call it the City of Righteousness. And we're glad to be here this afternoon with you. I currently am serving in the position as president of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, the state chapter. And I'm extremely glad to be here on this very, very important and sensitive topic of reparation and liberation. When I first take on the word and hear the word reparation, for me, the word struggle is paramount. Struggle of all of our ancestry who have really paved the way, and so many other groups of people that have seemed to have gotten some form of reparation, but it's not seen to be the case for our ancestry. So struggle seems to be the word because everybody seems to have one, but they seem to have gotten what they needed, but it still seemed to be an issue for us. So I'm looking forward to diving into the conversation today. Thank you for having me, Dr. Glover.
Mhm.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Glover, for the invitation to be here today. My name is Andrea McChristian. I'm the Law and Policy Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We are a legal policy and advocacy organization based in the city of Newark, New Jersey. I don't have an affiliated home church, but I'm sure I will by the end of this session, and I'm so happy to be here with you all today. I will say that when I think of the word reparations, I think of the time is now, because we know that this conversation of reparations has been dating all the way back to when 40 acres and a mule was promised to enslaved Africans, and that promise never came through. That goes on to when the late Representative John Conyers introduced reparations legislation at the federal level that now, just in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other unarmed Black people, is finally making movement at the federal level after decades of sitting stagnant. We're seeing in Evanston, Illinois, has become the first city to pay direct reparations to some of its citizens. And California has become the first state in the nation to create a reparations task force at the state-based level. And we're calling on New Jersey to become the second. And why? Many people think New Jersey is this place of great prosperity where all have the ability to prosper as well. And it is a place of great prosperity, but it's also very much a two Americas. At the Institute, a couple weeks ago now, we released a report, which I'm happy to send along to anyone, called Repairing the Cracks. And in this report, we looked at how COVID-19 had a particularly devastating impact on New Jersey's communities of color. Here in New Jersey as a whole, we had the second highest death rate in the nation from COVID-19. We were #1 for most of the pandemic, only being surpassed a few weeks ago by Mississippi. But this has disproportionately impacted Black communities. COVID-19 was the leading cause of death for Black New Jerseyans in 2020 and was about #3 or #4 for white New Jerseyans. And in Newark, where I work and where I live, which is about half Black, over 850 people died from COVID-19 between March 2020 and March 2021, exceeding the death toll of 5 states during that same time period. And we know that Black people are more likely to have the pre-existing conditions upon which COVID-19 preys, are more likely to be frontline essential workers, are more likely to live in crowded housing, and face higher unemployment and food insecurity than their peers. So why do I say all this? Because COVID-19 has exposed the cracks of structural racism in our foundation that have existed for centuries. As again, the Institute has noted in our Black and Brown in New Jersey 2021 agenda, New Jersey is home to some of the worst racial disparities in the country. Just to name a few, we have the highest disparity between Black to white infant mortality in the nation of over 3-to-1. We have the highest Black to white incarceration rates in both our adult prisons and our youth prisons. Within New Jersey, a Black person is 3 times more likely to face police force than a white person. We're the 6th most segregated state in the nation for Black students, and our white family median net wealth is $352,000, the highest in America, but it's only $6,100 for Black families. And so we can't understand these racial disparities in isolation, right? There's a reason we got here today. It's a history of intentionally designed systems, policies, and laws that divested resources from Black communities that have led to the racial disparities today. So I want to just lift very quickly, because I know we only have 5 minutes, 2 examples. So first, I want to talk about the racial wealth gap. As I mentioned, we have one of the highest racial wealth gaps in the nation. But this dates all the way back to the founding of the colony. When English settlers first came to the colony, they were given 150 acres automatically, and an additional 150 acres of land for every enslaved person they brought with them into the colony. A few years later, they were given 60 additional acres of land for every enslaved Black person they brought with them. Then we had a form of sharecropping called cottaging, which took place after the end of slavery. We then had redlining, racially restrictive covenants, foreclosures, predatory lending that all targeted the Black community. And so from our very founding as a colony, there was a divestment of property, one of the largest drivers of the racial wealth gap from Black communities, while also giving these benefits of property to white communities at the same time. Another story is a story I want to lift up of the Bordentown School. This was an elite state-run boarding school operated by New Jersey from the late 1800s after being founded by a former enslaved person. It was called the Tuskegee of the North after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, and educated generations of New Jersey Black students to become skilled in the trades or in professional manner. It was in Bordentown, New Jersey, over 400 acres. Again, it was a state-run elite boarding school for New Jersey's Black youth. It was visited by W.E.B. Du Bois, Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, just to name a few. After attempting to integrate and only attracting 2 white students, the school was closed in 1955. And now what sits on the land that was once home to the Tuskegee of the North, the Bordentown School? It's Hayes, New Jersey's only girls' youth prison. And across the street sits JMSF, the state's most secure youth prison for boys. So Bordentown has literally become the school to prison pipeline realized right here in New Jersey. And currently New Jersey has, again, as I mentioned, the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the country. So we used to be #1 in educating our Black youth and are now #1 in incarcerating them on that same land. And we're doing it at exorbitant waste. The state is currently spending almost $500,000 to incarcerate each young person in a state youth prison. That's over $50 million spent on incarcerating only 80 young people in youth prisons that are almost 80% empty. I'm sure we can all imagine what better use we could make in a young person's life with that much money each year. And these youth prisons aren't helping our young people, with about a quarter of them ending up right back within these facilities within 3 years. And so I lift up these 2 ideas because these are just 2 veins that show the history of divestment and the need for reparative systems and policies to address the harm. And so that's why the Institute and a number of partners launched Say the Word Reparations. We launched our campaign on Juneteenth because that's exactly what we need. We don't need to talk about racial equity. We don't need to talk about wealth disparities. We need to call it what it is. We need reparations to repair the harm of New Jersey's Black communities. And so there's a bill right now, A711 S322, it's in the legislature. It was introduced last legislative cycle during the 400-year anniversary of enslaved Africans first being brought to Virginia. It was reintroduced this year and has gained momentum in the wake of the murders of so many unarmed Black people. And so we're calling on the state to pass this important legislation. It would meet for 2 years. It would do an in-depth analysis of this history of slavery and its lasting legacy to include both public members, historians, legislators. It would have public hearings, at least 6 public hearings throughout the state, to hear from directly impacted people who can say, my family experienced this divestment personally. And then at the end, it'll put together policy proposals for the governor and the state to take into account to develop policies, practices, and yes, financial payments to try and address this harm. But we understand it's a comprehensive system because, you know, when people think of reparations, they think, oh, just cutting Black people a check. Financial implications and payment is part of it, but it's part of it in every single aspect. At the state level, if we, for example, call for student loan cancellation, if we call for canceling closing youth prisons and reinvesting in communities, if we call for making sure incarcerated people who are disproportionately Black have the opportunity to vote, those all speak to reparations. And those speak to money and investments that we need to make in Black communities to make them whole. And so we're hoping that all of you who are listening in today are inspired to support this important legislation. You can go to 400yearsnj.org to tweet, email, and call your legislators and the governor to push this task force forward, because we really need to, in this powerful moment, make sure we're putting meaning behind the proclamation that Black Lives Matter by making investments in Black lives. So that's hopefully my 5 minutes, and I'm free to answer any questions that may come up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was powerful, and that was more than a notion. You laid it out so clearly. You laid it out so clearly. One of the things that is clear is that it is true. It's been said that America's original sin is racism. Racism is America's original sin. It's clear that that's true. When something becomes an ism, there's an institution that goes on with it. It becomes an institution. It becomes an institution in and of itself. And the institution continues to keep things as they are, keeps things moving. The longevity of something, I think, is connected with this institutionalization. One of the other institutions of society is education. And you mentioned about, this pipeline with education. So what I'm wondering is, I'm wondering if fundamentally, when it came down to integration, has integration been an asset to us as a people here in New Jersey, or has it been a liability? And if it's been a liability, what has it reinforced? Has integration in terms of education here in New Jersey for us proved to be an asset? And if so, how has it been an asset? Or a liability? If it's been a liability, how has it been a liability, and what has it reinforced? Dr. Spagner, would you like to get us going with this, sir?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You asked the question and it triggered something for me.
Okay.
At the graduate level, my degree is in accounting. And so I know something about assets and liabilities. And there's a differential there. But
Yes,
let
sir.
me answer the question, Dr. Glover, in this way. When I own your question personally, I would say that it has been an asset for me, but a liability to the community that I represent. Let me restate that. It has been an asset. Education has been an asset for me, but what I am guilty of being a part of a community that I haven't done all that I can do and should do to make sure that the liability that comes with integration has served on my community. In my own family, I'm one of 11. Things work well for me. But for the bulk of the other members, my siblings, it has been a liability. So that leaves us at a point where I need to do something about that scenario. Because in an ideal situation, in a business context, you want your assets to exceed your liabilities.
Yeah.
All right. But I submit to you that at an individual level, and I think that may be true for a large segment of the aging African-American community that came through in the 60s and the 70s, and Johnson and Kennedy did some things or whatever that provided resources for education, Title I, all of those kinds of things. Those are assets, but that comes with some liabilities that serve our community. So let me just stop at that point.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Lassiter, what's going on?
Well, let me tie that to and stick with my word with struggle in terms of answering that, and echo what my colleague just shared in terms of asset liability. But then I'm going to tie in your word, Dr. Glover. It became a liability from my perspective, being that the ism that then created this corridor that not everybody gets to go down. It is selective. It doesn't give the same opportunity, and so I clearly think it's been a liability, because research says, when we go back, that we had more Black-owned businesses, we had more thriving schools, we had communities that were thriving. When we talk about economics, and there's a measure in economics called the economic measure of the velocity of money. And that simply says that money circulates within a community on an average in suburbia America 7 times those dollars go within a community. I believe that in the time when we had our own Black-owned businesses, those dollars circulated within our Black-owned community. The liability, the ism, the racism, the corridor that has been created has created that maybe perhaps integration has, because we all didn't get opportunity to integrate. That's my colleague's point, has caused a breakdown so that dollars in our community does not go 7 times. It doesn't go. It goes 1.5 times within the Patterson communities and like communities like ours that keeps the separation in terms of schools being in a struggle, keep economic development for Black-owned businesses in a struggle, that keeps us, just to keep our neighborhood, here's a small one, clean is a struggle. So we got all of these, the residue of not having the reparations that we deserve, that we should get, that was stated early in the opening comment, that the layers, it isn't just giving us a check, but the layers of our community that needs those policies as well as dollars to go hand in hand. So I'm gonna stand on this. You guys can shift me, but I'm standing on it that it is a liability, and it has been a liability for us.
Okay. Lieutenant Colonel?
Yes, ma'am. I too see it as a liability. As the brothers were speaking there, I thought about my own family, just my immediate family, my parents and my siblings. My parents did not go to college, but they ensured that we were able to. My older 2 sisters went off to Morgan State and Howard University and called back home to say to my parents, get them out of the public school system. They need to go to parochial school systems, because when they get to college, they're not going to have the tools that they need. And so my parents struggled and sacrificed in order that we would be able to go to private schools. So we came out of the settings where my friends were. And so we went to the private schools, and then we went off to college. And so thankfully I was able to have that education, afforded that opportunity, and then to go off to college, but to return back and see those who did not have those opportunities, and seeing the integration, yes, but also almost the segregation once I returned, to see someone on the same street as me who did not have 2 parents in the home, who did not have the opportunity to get away and see differently. I certainly think that has become a liability, and it continues, I believe, today, even in our communities. When we look at our churches, many of us do ministry in the inner cities, but after Sunday morning, we get in our cars, and where do we go? A lot of us are not living in the same places that we're ministering. And so how does that affect our communities? So I certainly see it as a liability. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. No, I think I'll just say it's all cyclical. So we were talking in the 1950s, 1960s about, okay, we need to integrate that. That's the next way forward. And here in New Jersey, it's like that never even happened to some extent. As I mentioned, New Jersey currently has the 6th most segregated state in the nation for its Black students. We aren't integrated here in New Jersey. Most Black students are attending school with mostly Black students. Most white students are attending school with mostly white students. We know what tracks with that is the resources, where you can go to a school in Newark and you can go to school in Short Hills and have no idea that those are teaching the same grades of young people because of the investment and the resources in that. And there's actually a lawsuit right now filed against a number of lawyers, including Elise Badia of Rutgers, against the state to say, you have not fulfilled your duty to integrate. It's a huge integration suit that the state has fought, has been going on for, I think, a couple of years now. And so this issue of, we haven't even fully integrated as a state to understand, okay, is this working or not? We have not made that promise, which is obviously disproportionately harming our Black and brown young people. So I encourage everyone to follow that lawsuit. It's not, it comes up every now and again in the news, but something very much going on to see on the other side of that, what solutions and remedies are going to be put forward so that we actually can see, does the integration model work, and how could it be used most effectively?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My mother is 95. Dr. Spagner knows my mother real well, very, very well. And my mother's story is my mother was one of 2 children, and my mother's mother was a one-room school teacher, in North Carolina. My mother's father went as far as the 6th grade in North Carolina. And my mother in school, grade school, she did very well, this kind of thing. And when she was in her senior year of high school, she wanted to go to college. And she wanted to go to Montclair. She wanted to go to college to Montclair State, I think it was at that time. Wanted to be a school teacher. And that was what she had her heart set on. She had great grades, the whole thing. Her parents said to her, "You are going to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Your people are from down there." If I were preaching, I'd say I can't get no help up in here. But the point is, her family in that moment did something that literally saved her. And I say that, I think for this reason, something happens with us. I think is it possible that when we find ourselves in schools where whites are, in a certain community, we assume that we're experiencing, quote unquote, a good education. We assume that we're getting that. We don't even think about evaluating a curriculum because of the company that we're in, never realizing that there is a pipeline, never realizing that the curriculum is reinforcing something. That being the case, how do we begin to liberate the mind? We can get money from reparations, blah, 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 blah. But if for some of us, can I just put it out? Some of us value whiteness over everything. Whiteness over everything. There's nothing wrong with being white. If God made you white, that was intentional, God bless you. But there's nothing wrong with being Black at all. There's no difference in value, quality, whatever. How do we liberate the mind? Because it seemed to me, if we liberate the mind, then objecting to some of these things, these disparities would begin to happen. So I'm coming back to you, Andrea, when you think about, your work. If you had to suggest to us, what some education would look like, what would be 3 things you would want us, we are community people in the community. What would you hope that community folk, that the church people, because we represent church, what I mean? What would you hope that we could get a hold of and communicate and push, that that could help us, what would those three things be? And then if I could hear responses from the rest of you, go ahead.
Dr. Glover, that's a big question, because it's how do you, when you were speaking, it kind of reminded me, I'm paraphrasing that Harriet Tubman quote, like, I could have freed 100 more if only they had known that they were slaves. It's this idea that we have to battle a mentality that was created by white supremacy, where white supremacy, if that's all we know, and that's the power structure, then it's going to want to fuel itself and rebuild itself by saying that everything associated with it is the best. And thus marginalized communities should rise to meet that level. So I think if I had to quantify it, I would say one, public education, because when we come out with reports, we come out with fact sheets, you can go to our website, njisj.org, where people don't know these numbers. People don't know about the Bordentown School. And we used to have an elite Black school that was known nationwide for its education, and now it's a prison. People don't know that. So I think one, public education, make sure everyone knows what's going on. I think two, and again, it's just going back to investment, something that our president and CEO, Ryan Haygood, is married to Charity Haygood, who is the principal of Avon Avenue School here in Newark. During the pandemic, when the young people had to go home, a big issue was remote learning. A lot of these kids didn't have laptops. How am I going to learn if I have no way to access my teacher? And so a national TV show found out about this and donated hundreds of laptops for the young people to gain access. But the young people got the laptops, but they didn't have internet. And so again, all of these issues and these barriers we face, a lot of it goes down to investments, where again, a young person in a more prestigious white community never has to worry about this. They can say, I could just go home, go on my laptop and be looped in. Whereas our young Black and brown children living in our urban centers have all these additional thoughts they have to go to before they can even figure out how to get online for schooling. So I think resources are pouring in that investment. And I think the third thing is just conversations like this, where one, we have like-minded people here, but we're also reaching, where each one of us can reach someone. I know sometimes it gets exhausting. This work is exhausting, but it's one needed that we fortify our troops, so that we're able to get as many people as possible in the fight. And if each of us can touch somebody and educate them, let them know about the investments that need to be made, then we can get a groundswell to make the change that we're hoping to see. So I think if I had to quantify that huge question into three things, those are the things that pop to mind.
Okay. Anyone?
Dr. Glover, I just want to jump in, and one of the things that you said, and it really hit home for me, this work is exhausting. When I think of the Black church and the different generations within our churches, multi-generational, and I think of the millennials and how they want to get after it now because we're woke and we want to do something in this struggle now. And then I think of former generations and the sit-ins and the marching and the work, the energy that has gone into so many movements, and not feeling as if we've made very much progress. That is exhausting. But to your point, Dr. Glover, of changing the mindset, when I think just within my own church, and thinking of getting one generation to move into the technology piece of it, I just think of how difficult that has been. And you wonder almost, is it in vain? But then you say, I can't give up now. We've made a little bit of progress. And so I think that becomes a huge part when we're talking about the education piece. It's almost as if you want to do it in segments. Let me teach this generation, and then let me teach the next, because when we come together for blended learning, it becomes almost a conflict at times, because we have to educate of why we're doing it this way, and then teach the history of how we did it then. And I can see the frustration. Yes, I see, but we also see the progress and the hope that we have through Christ, and that we have to continue. We have to press our way, because we do need to educate not only within the church, within our community, but then our white brothers and sisters. They also need to be educated. And so, yes, I get the frustration, and that it can also be exhausting.
Okay. Dr. Lassiter.
I'm sticking where I was. I'm staying in the struggle. Okay, so everything that you said, and the more information and the more enlightenment that I'm getting just in this dialogue and discussion of things I didn't know, always keep, it brings mind that there's still a struggle. So when we talk about this mind of how do we get to the mind, how do we get to this liberation piece, it shows more of the devastation and almost diabolical in terms of racism and what it has caused in terms of whether our thinking or the thinking of people who feel as though they're privileged. And so what I think I know is, if there was any progress in this effort of equality, it was that people came to the light, and because I am the church, because I am a representative of Jesus Christ, this is my perspective, is that the medium, the Christ principle becomes the eye-opening pieces that bring oppressors and those who see it and then repent from their behavior and then join in, watch this, join in with the struggle of correcting a horrible wrong. So this whole point where people still don't see, and when my sister shares those horrible, gruesome facts of New Jersey, the place in which I reside and live, information I did not know, it just brings to mind that this separation, that a place where I am can be so racist and then brag about who we are with all of this, then somewhere the liberation hasn't come on both ends. And so for me, it is the liberation message of the gospel, of the social gospel that Christ brings, that is paramount and has to be included in this conversation, along with our political, our policies, our economic, that we can't leave out that part, because if I'm going to get to the mind of sometime my dialogue won't do it, but maybe the word of God can do it. So I want to add that to the equation, to the variable, to the mix of all of those other things that we're doing, the research that we're doing, it's got to be a new, like the scripture that says, "Let this mind be in you." I got to get them out of their mind, and they got to get into the mind of Christ, because folk don't see. Because anytime you take a productive educational school and now it is a prison, hands down, and folk don't see anything wrong with that. I didn't know, or the folk who did it didn't see anything wrong with it, then they are clearly blind, being deceived. Who was it? They've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, right? So clearly somebody, human beings, that is no way, it is no way we can go that way, in that direction, and nobody says anything with all of the disparities that are happening. So I want to add to the mix of the struggle, then this social gospel has to be included in the policy making. It has to be included in the economic development talk. It has to be included in the educational process. We cannot leave out the answer. If King used that as the platform, Dr. King used that as the platform, people don't talk about it much, but that was the model that he used. He used the Bible to use it. He used the Jesus model. All I know is somebody said it still works. He still works. And so I got to include him in the struggle of what we're doing in the process. So I'm taking notes, because I got work to do after this panel discussion is over. You all are enlightening me. I got work to do here at this local church, and within the community and within the convention for which I serve, which our convention is called the Progressive National Baptist Church. Our whole premise of our convention being founded was founded on being progressive of social justice. It is the bedrock of our convention. So I got to get up to snuff. I gotta go back to school. So thanks again, Dr. Glover, for always putting me in school and connecting me with all of these great teachers. So this is the day that I thought I was the teacher here at Calvary, but this is the day that the teacher went back to school. So I'm glad to be in the house. This is good for me.
Okay, Dr. Spagner.
All right. Everyone has dispersed pearls of wisdom and insight. And I just want to jump in and basically collaborate and agree with everything that has been stated. Education is all about a journey of enlightenment. You know, the metaphors that come to mind is that you go on a journey and you go from ignorance, literally, to being more knowledgeable. So I think that when I look back, as I originally stated, the asset aspect versus the liability aspect, there is some information that you have shared with us today. Our expert on the panel has shared with us information about our own state that I did not know. And I've heard about boarding school. I've actually been into the area. I mean, one of our districts, the Bethany district, is right in the heart of that boarding school, etc. So there's so much information that needs to be shared by those who feel that they made it through the integration dimension and came out better for it. And also recognize that there were many that were exposed to that sense of integration, that it was a failed proposition. It did not serve them well, therefore it did not serve our community well, because I would submit to you without statistics that there's a larger number of persons who did not bode well coming out of integration, as opposed to those of us who think that we did okay. I also want to acknowledge what Dr. Glover shared regarding her mother and some aspects there. There's one thing that I know that I admit that I missed. Yesterday, in one of the conferences that I attended on the same topic, one of the attorney from Virginia shared with us that he remembered all of his elementary school teachers, but he did not, after integration into the white school, he does not remember any of the instructors at the high school level. I submit to you that I remember every single one of my grade school teachers and the individual personal experiences that I had with them, and the fact that periodically they would remind me that if you don't shape up, I'm going to call Bishop Johnson, who was my pastor. But it was that level of intimacy and awareness that when you go into the integrated mode, you sorely miss that kind of caring, nurturing. And so that's the asset and the liability. But again, I think that we have to be holistic in looking back over the history and acknowledge the benefits that accrue to us that went through integration, but also admit the damage that was done as a result of it. And watch this. When we get through doing that case analysis, and our subject matter expert has the data for us to consider, you come to the current situation in Newark. And just by mentioning the cities, mention Newark, and you have there's a story. Mention that in comparison to Short Hills, Summit, New Jersey, and other cities, Montclair. Mention those others, and there's a diabolical difference. And what do? 50 years ago, they suggested integration would bring about equity and a standard of excellence for all people. Well, now that we are where we are today, what is our recommendation for getting equitable distribution and allocation of resources such that the Newark school system can have the same standard of excellence that we find in Short Hills? And so I think information, education is a critical first step. And I'm with my brother and with my sisters on this panel. It means work. Evan Spagner has to deal with what Dr. Dreckford said earlier. I have in my church, in our church, there are young people that's ready to go out and do the Black Lives Matter thing. And then you have the older members, senior citizens, my peers, who are saying, wait a minute, can't your efforts be better served by doing this, this, and this? And so we've got to find a way to stratify that community and the curriculum to make sure that both, it's not one or the other, but both need to be informed and invited to the struggle, so that we come up with a recommendation that's going to provide us with a game plan that will assure us as citizens, as elected officials and legislators, that the equity that Newark deserves is on par with Short Hills.
Right.
So I think that we need to acknowledge the struggle, but then we need to be about our Father's business. So I'm with you 100%, and it's work.
Sure.
That it is. Our time is closing swiftly. What a conversation. Oh my goodness, what a conversation. Two things come to mind. And then after I share these two things, I'll just ask for a takeaway, a brief takeaway that each one of you have, and that would be good. What comes to my mind is how Jesus blasted the religious leaders of his day. He blasted them. I'm thinking about Matthew chapter 23. And he says to them, basically, he calls them a bunch of hypocrites, right? He goes to that. And in 23:23, he says something like this to them. And Jesus was a radical who wasn't concerned about just comforting everyone. You know, Jesus was a radical. And so Jesus said to them, like, you know what? You got your tithing down. You tithe mint, you tithe from all the herbs and stuff like that, but you neglect justice. You neglect love. You neglect mercy. Yeah, you should have kept the tithing right. But the tithing, the quote unquote, the stuff we associate with worship, that's great. Jesus says that's great, but that's not the whole picture. The other part is the love, the mercy, and the justice. And the love isn't self-serving. It isn't for us to serve ourselves. It's for love to go beyond us. It's the mercy, and it is the work of justice at the same time. So that's the thing that really lands heavily and hard for me about this work. If we don't, who will? Right? Who will? Who will? Dr. Drakeford, your takeaway?
Yes, ma'am. So two things that I take away from this conversation, and just, it's been a great conversation. And yes, I have homework assignments. But what kept coming to me is God is with us. God is certainly with us in this. He will re-energize us and keep us on course. But not only is God with us, but also what came to mind is we, the leaders in the church, must show up. We have to show up and do the work within our communities. We have to do the work within the state level. We have to stand behind organizations such as the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice. We, the body of Christ, must show up and demand a seat at the table. The same way that you all just shared the work that's being done within your own churches and responsibilities that you feel that you have, we, the body of Christ, must show up. While we may not agree with how different movements are doing things now, we have to show up and teach perhaps the way that we could do it a little differently, teach the history of how we've done it in the past. But if we don't show up, then what happens in the struggle? And so that's the two things that I want to leave, is that God is with us, but we must show up.
Mhm. Thank you. Dr. Spagner.
All right, I perceive an opportunity, and that is to create a path forward. And just based on this panel and just our discussion today, and certainly my thoughts are informed by the other sessions that I had the privilege of listening in on. But if we were to start with, whether it's our individual even starting with our own family, but our congregations, and then on concentric circle basis, going out to other organizations that we have influence and impact with, that there needs to be some basic education that my dear sister, attorney Andrea, I hope it's the right way to pronounce your first name. I remember you visiting us at Fountain. So I would hope that you would consider coming again. I just want to throw out that invitation. But Andrea, the types of things that you have shared today with us, somehow we need to find a way to deploy those bits of information in manageable chunks to our congregation. And as we come up with manageable chunks, those of us that are theologians, preachers, teachers, or whatever within the context of the church need to be prepared that facing the facts, that there is room for inspiration and there is room for challenge.
Yes.
And ultimately, after I inspire you, having looked at the facts, that in spite of all of the darkness of the past or whatever, we're still here. So there's some room for inspiration, but also to challenge us that things are not as they should be. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us as believers to adhere to the biblical scripture that in Isaiah 58 that points out that all of your worship ceremony is for naught if you're not doing the following. Then we can after challenging them, also empower them along with ourselves to do what my brother said earlier, get into the struggle if you're not already there. And that we need all hands on board. So just to repeat, I think that basic educational piece is critical. Because why are we even having this conversation? We need to start with that. What is the problem that is so overwhelming that we need to listen up and then prepare to do something about it? So let me get off the soapbox, but that's where my heart is at this hour.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrea.
Thank you so much. And I was so glad to be part of this important conversation. I learned a lot from everyone here that I'm going to take back to my organization. But I think something that Reverend Spagner said earlier, and I'd be happy to come back to the church at any time, stuck with me about the generations and about the differences in how we approach justice. And I think that's why I feel so strongly about the issue of reparations, because this isn't something new. This is something that for hundreds of years we've been calling for. Since we were freed, we've said we need to repair this harm and be really made free, not just giving us legal freedom. And so while we're seeing the Black Lives Matter movement calling for reparations, this is a continued conversation that we can all unite around as a main push for justice and repair. And so I'm excited we're having this conversation about it. I think that reparations is the formative movement that can, one, unite us as a people, but also try and fight some of these damning racial disparities that we have in the state. And so I'm so happy to have this conversation and join with all of you to make that reality here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Lassiter.
So let me end where I started. So the struggle for me will be this. And we also know that struggling ultimately is a process moving towards victory. To get there, no pain, no gain. It's not a struggle that I'm going to be defeated. We know every other group have used the struggle of Black people, used the formula of Black people for their own liberation. You can call it out. You can just go and see it. I'm not going to call any groups out, but groups has used the model and called for reparations and got it using our model. It just seemed to not been on our part. So the struggle, I'm going to continue the struggle. I'm going to continue to take my Bible and preach from the Bible for which I have been called to do. The one in which I believe in, the one in which I believe who is the Savior, who is the Redeemer of the world. I will continue to preach that gospel, but also in my other hand, because of this prolific attorney who has come here today, I'm gonna also preach with the Repairing the Cracks in my hand. And so I'm gonna have to get a copy of Repairing the Crack and begin to make, as Dr. Spagler said, I have to bring inspiration along with education to Repairing the Cracks and begin to move on. And then this has been, I think Dr. Glover was deliberate. So this has been paramount for me in terms of a starting point for our convention on my tenure that I am coming into. I'm just fresh into the tenure. And so this gives us a operating place because there's already, you all have already done the work. I've become another voice, another leg in the journey, in the struggle. So I'm grounded now to do some additional work with the contacts that we have coming here. In fact, we got the governor. He's coming. I'm going to say this. He's coming to worship with us on Sunday, right? So that's the whole point, right? You can't come, governor. Y'all know how I go. Are you coming to stay, or you just come to have words? Now, if you come to stay, I'll let you speak. But if you're not, you probably need to pick another church. But he's coming to stay. So that means we're going to have, this opens up to initially have a conversation about what it is that we need here in the North in terms of the work that's going on. And you have given me more than talking points, but you've given me ammunition for a future dialogue and a future discussion to have with him and others, with my Bible and with the Repairing the Cracks. So I'm looking forward to my struggle. I'm looking forward.
Thank you so much, all of you, for contributing, for sharing your heart, for sharing your hope. And thank you, because now it's up to us to bring to pass what is within our reach. God bless you all.
Thank you.